Today I'm talking to an extraordinary person who has kindly written and curated a collection of cue cards for cards, the universe and everything. Angela Maxwell walked for 6 years and 20,000 miles around the world, and in these interviews she will talk about her experiences as she travelled the globe. Angela, thank you so much for doing this. The first question is a big one. As I understand it, you were living a comfortable life in Bend, Oregon, running a successful business, and then essentially you decide to leave the comfortable life behind you and set off to walk around the world. What motivated you to do this?
Right. Well, I love this question because oftentimes when we go to change something, it's when things aren't well. Everything was great for me. Again, I did have my own business. I lived in a great place in Bend, Oregon, very close to my best friend, relationship, career, everything was going really well. And I heard about a man who was walking potentially around the world. And it's hard to describe, but it's like that light bulb moment. Like, that's a brilliant idea. Like, who has walked around the world? We know our ancestors have to some degree, but that was over long periods of time. It wasn't one person necessarily doing this long journey. So I just became quite obsessed with the idea. I started finding different adventurers, and where they traveled to, whether they sailed, whether they walked, whether they ran. And I was just like trying to um, really devour everything I could. And I think that fed that this idea, as crazy as it was for someone like me, where I drove to work every day, I hiked sometimes, but I had never camped alone. I didn't know how to start an outdoor fire successfully without fire starter, where you take your lighter fluid and stuff. So I didn't have any experience, but the idea was so compelling that it was one of those, I'm either going to convince myself not to do this, and possibly regret it most of my life, or I'm going to give it a try. I might succeed, I might fail, whatever the case, it'll be a grand adventure. And I'd say after about mm, 3 months of since I heard about the guy walking, had the idea, started reading people's books, I started telling people, I think I'm going to go do this crazy thing. And once I said I was going to do it, I had to do it.
So that was part of the commitment process, is actually just telling people, I'm going to go off and walk the world, and making it harder for you to pull out because you'd simply said it to people.
Yes. Yes. I think that was, it's almost, yeah. It's like when we go to make changes and we tell people, especially friends and family, and want that support that we're going to do this thing, they're going to hold us accountable to it. The one thing that I know that you do not find is validation, meaning when you tell people you're going to do some crazy idea, not everyone agrees. And so I also think it's important who you tell. You are seeking that kind of support. Hey, I have this crazy idea, and you want someone who's going to say, "That's great. How can I support you?" Especially when they're really off the wall, ideas.
I didn't think of it like that. So you were looking for validation, but some close friends and family said, "Ooh, don't do that."
Oh, of course, of course. The most common thing was, well, why don't you just go for a hike on the weekend? Why don't you just go hike the Pacific Crest Trail or the Camino? There were a lot of people who were like, why do you need to go walk the whole world? You could just, like, you have no experience. Why don't you go just do these small little bits? And I think I love that phrase, go big or go home. I was like, no, I want to walk around the world. I don't want to just go for a hike.
Okay, so you chose to do this by yourself and you decided to hike. How exactly did you decide the terms and conditions of your venture?
Yeah, I have to say that was in part inspiration from the way that different people had done it before. I remember there was a woman who ran around the world. She's from Wales, and she lived on $5 a day, and she camped everywhere. And I thought, great, check. I'll put that on my list. Next was, well, make sure you have a good water filter. Okay, check. A lot of it was because I didn't have the experience. Was how can I learn from others who have already done it? Right? I think we all appreciate when we can learn from someone else's mistakes. So having no experience, I just started to kind of make a list and make notes of what seemed to work for other people. So, for example, oftentimes people think that I backpacked around the world. And I think, most of the people who did long journeys, they put things on wheels because you can carry more water, you can carry more food. So you have more likelihood to survive in extreme conditions.
This sounds like it happened almost spontaneously. Was the lack of preparedness part of the attraction to you?
I think I really was motivated on taking what seemed to work for other people and then finding what worked for me. So I was excited. I was actually excited about, stepping into the unknown and knowing I'm probably going to fail at a few things or at least trip over, going to get some scrapes and bruises. I knew, for example, jumping into places like Australia and the Outback, that there are many people who die of heat stroke and dehydration. You can't be naive about stepping into something that, it fits kind of into a survival category. But, you know, I loved the idea of preparing, but I also really understood you can't ever truly prepare for something. I mean, you can do your best, but if you've never experienced it, it's only in that experience you're going to actually learn what works for you. So I was motivated and I was excited to learn what worked for me. And definitely some of those notes and those things that other people, had experienced, I found that nope, that doesn't work for me. And in part it ended up even being in ways how I walked, uh, in terms of walking more kind of what I feel intuitively. Oh, do I go to the left? Do I go to the right? How do I do those things? And that was just a learning process over the whole experience.
So you chose Australia first. Why was that?
Well, I kind of had a sense. So I was on the west coast of the US, and I knew that I kind of like the idea that I'm leaving from my best friend's house and I'll return by foot. So I kind of decided I wanted to go west, particularly because I grew up on the east coast of the US, and there was something about walking from the west to the east. It didn't, I think, excite me as much. And I thought it'd be much nicer to have a homecoming, just the last stretch of the leg being in a place that's very familiar, the culture and stuff like that, the language. So I knew I wanted to go west. And so I kind of had this idea that it would be great if I could touch upon four continents. And Australia just kind of called me. I'm an introvert and I love the idea of the solitude in the desert, as terrifying as the desert can be when you don't know how to find water or, get food. But I just knew this was going to be a good place to start.
So you land in Perth, Australia. What equipment did you bring with you, and what did you get when you arrived in Perth?
Yeah, well, the answer to that is way too much. I think as any someone who starts hiking or doing something new, you usually have a lot more than you need. Um, so I I had a bunch of stuff, and so I use for an example, I had um, like a few pairs of jean pants that I would never wear and end up throwing away later. Way too many pairs of shoes. I think I probably had 150 pounds of stuff to fit into. Yeah, and that's not with the water, to fit into the cart I was going to push. And at the time, it was just, for those who might know, it's kind of like when you see people jogging, like with the baby strollers. It was a two seater for babies that you could jog with, and I had to stuff everything in there. And so I had everything that I thought I would need in terms of tent and sleeping bag. But when I landed in Perth, this is where I had to get the essentials. Like, I had to stock up on 2-minute noodles, which again was something I learned from someone else. If you're going to live on $5 a day, your diet's not going to be so great. So you're going to buy a bag of oatmeal and you're going to get some 2-minute noodles, carry as much as you can as you're heading out into the desert, and stock up on as much water as possible. And I think I started with like 25 liters when I was leaving Perth, and heading
Wow.
kind of a bit through the suburbs until I actually got a little bit more to the coast and then into the Kimberley.
So the Outback can be a dangerous place. Anybody who was a 1980s Neighbours fan will know this. Spiders, snakes, desert, incredible heat, and you just walked into it?
Correct. And the thing is, what's very interesting is the outback in general is where it's wide open desert space. So in Western Australia, it's really interesting because it's like desert meets the ocean. There was at one point I was kind of hugging along the ocean before I kind of went a little bit more east inward so that I could get, through the Kimberley and then actually get up towards the Darwin area where I landed in Columbaroo. Um, And so even though I knew that a lot of people, yes, did would perish in the desert, I did always, because it was also my first continent, I always made sure that I wouldn't be more than about 2 days walk from something. So on my map, I would see that there's going to be a little township, or, there might be an Aborigine community. There, I knew that there was always somewhere, if I was desperate, potentially if I don't get lost, I could make it somewhere. Luckily, I never had to do that. Like I never had to go to a place because I was desperate for it. Um, but yeah.
And this was your first experience really being by yourself. Had you experienced that at all in your life before heading off on the journey? In terms of days on end of not bumping into anyone, or
well, I think I could experience that, just being an introvert and really liking that, but I mean, I probably would try to cater that for myself to have some of that time, but nothing like that. Nothing like being truly alone in the wilderness, and in the desert. I had never experienced anything quite like it. And as much as I was looking forward to it, I think I surprised myself just how much I loved it.
So you ended up walking around 2,000 miles. What were the biggest challenges you faced?
Yeah, well, one of the biggest challenges I found in Australia, I mean, was not only trying to find water, and sometimes it would be I'd navigate myself to a dirt road where I knew some trucks, delivering supplies up north and down south would go, and I'd, twice I'd have to stand there and hang my water bottle upside down, which I learned was the signal for I'm in the desert, I need water. Um, but it was also, I had difficulty getting a good distance with the heat and the sun. I mean, at some points, my skin, I had blisters and boils all over my arms. I got to one point where there was a good month where I had to walk before the sun rose. And, by 7:30 in the morning, it was blistering hot, and I would have to create shade, between these spindly little tiny trees and termite mounds. And I'd have to, hang up a cotton dress, and, I'd have to tuck myself under the shade and just wait for the sun to, pass over for several hours. So sometimes I was really crunched up in just a tiny little shaded area that I made, to avoid the sun. And so it made it really hard to walk and get a good distance. That was one of the more difficult challenges, because there was nowhere to take breaks and get shade. I had to make shade.
Before we go on to the next leg of your journey, what were your takeaways from Australia?
Well, I loved Australia for many reasons, but one of the things that I really loved was I got in touch more fully with myself being alone, really in a what seems like a harsh environment. But what I found fascinating was there were always birds. There were always animals that could lead you to water. I mean, it almost was this sense of like the desert stripped me down because, again, I had sunburn. I did get heat stroke at one point. I mean, it was like, can I do this? It pushed me up against my edges, but then I kept going. So I really found, I think, that perseverance in the desert. And for that reason, I fell in love with Australia. And I fell in love with the desert itself.
Okay, so that concludes this first video. We've now broken the rest of the videos down to shorter segments. Now we've done the introduction, so we'll be taking you through each part of Angela's journey as we go forward. The next stop is Vietnam, so please make sure you watch that. Thank you.